Hello, welcome to the 2020 Virtual Think Tank of the National Institutes of Historically Underserved Students. Introducing WVU Parkersburg's president, Dr. Chris Gilmore.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us all that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. Sometimes the bend of that arc is very difficult to see, but the HBCU system has been bending it for almost 2 centuries. HBCUs are indeed a crown jewel of American higher education, and it is my great honor to have served 3 of them in my career. This morning's session of the Research Alliance on Post-Secondary Success at HBCUs is sponsored and convened by the Regional Educational Lab Southeast at Florida State University and co-sponsored by the National Institutes for Historically Underserved Students as part of our Fall 2020 virtual think tank. I thank my friends at Florida State for the honor of making opening remarks and will yield shortly to them for the official beginning of their meeting. My friend Dr. Latara Osborne Lapkin and I conceived and co-founded this alliance a few years ago, and it has been actively supported by all 6 of the HBCUs in Mississippi: Alcorn State University, Hines Community College Utica campus, Jackson State University, Mississippi Valley State University, Rust College, and Tougaloo College, and I stated them in alphabetical order so as not to give preference to any of my friends. Today, leaders from these historic institutions are joined by delegates of the National Institutes representing more than 20 states and the District of Columbia. These delegates will be enriched by and enriching to this important conversation. Anyone with a question or a comment should type it into the chat area and it'll be shared with the facilitators to address. This afternoon, we'll reconvene at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a training session on cultural competence, immediately followed by the meeting of our delegates, during which we will unveil the toolkit the National Institutes has developed to facilitate conversations on campuses nationwide about their readiness to serve underserved students. Tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll host our very special closing celebration. You are all invited to attend all of those virtual sessions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Smith, Vice President at WVU Parkersburg and CEO of our Jackson County campus, also a graduate of Jackson State University, who will introduce a very special guest who has joined us to bring greetings. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. Good morning from WVUP, and I welcome you all to this most precious event. I'd like to introduce a personal friend of mine that I met some 30 years ago in a cafeteria at Mary Holmes College, located in West Point, Mississippi. When I met him, I knew that he would go on to do great things, because being in this business, sometimes you will see young people and you just know that they have that it factor, and this man did. On October 21st, 2017, the Executive Committee of the NAACP National Board of Directors elected Derek Johnson as president and CEO. And since that time, he has been a longstanding member and leader of NAACP. And Mr. Johnson has guided the association through periods of re-envisioning and reinvigoration. Born in Detroit, Michigan, Mr. Johnson attended Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. He then continued on to Houston, Texas to receive his Juris Doctorate from South Texas College of Law. In later years, Mr. Johnson furthered his training through fellowships and with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, the George Washington University School of Political Management, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He has served as guest lecturer. He has also served as the adjunct professor at our dear old Tougaloo College. It is without question, he is a leader of men, of women, and of children. He is my friend, and he is a friend of the people. I introduce Mr. Derek Johnson.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction and the opportunity. Dr. Gilmore, thank you for reaching out. As you all convene for this conference, understanding that the profile of the students that you are speaking of, that is me, that was me, that are many of the young people who grew up in the neighborhood I grew up in, Detroit. And it's so important for institutions to serve students who were born in certain zip codes outside of their control, outside of their ability to choose the level of quality education they will receive K through 12, to choose the environments that they are growing in, to choose any of the life indicators. And because of institutions like Tougaloo, my alma mater, or Jackson State, or many other campuses across the country that are built to serve students with a profile like I had, whether urban communities or rural communities, whether families that are broken up or families that are put together out of circumstances that result of economic conditions, there need to be a pathway for students with my profile. Now, with that said, I cannot think of a better avenue for someone like me than a HBCU. Also understand that there are many other institutions that serve underserved children, both in West Virginia and Kentucky and across this nation. If this nation is ever to reach its full potential, it must invest in young people. It must invest in young people K through 12, but if that is lacking because of the zip code they are born in, there are those students who graduated with a 1.8 GPA like I did, who need the level of support and nurturing that they were lacking in K through 12, who will benefit from the exposure that can be provided, who can learn what is possible. Many of my friends had no concept what was possible because we came from families that were surviving. We came from families that simply did not know. The greatest migration on this planet was the migration of Black folks moving from the South to the North. The second largest migration on this planet was working poor whites in the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia, migrating from those areas to the North, all pursuing a better quality of life, all being neglected in terms of educational opportunities, all being maligned and exploited for readily available cheap labor, all being subjected to a racial social construct that would use race as a tool to control the modes of production and the cost of labor, none of whom were properly invested in. But now we find ourselves in a scenario where all of those same communities, when you take away the racial construct, are afforded an opportunity because of institutions that were built to serve them. Continue this important convening. It is important for us to begin to talk across communities. It is important for us to continue to talk across campus. It is important for us to identify and leverage best practices so that the many, many students who have the potential to do well can have the benefit of their talents added to society to make both their community and this nation a stronger nation. So thank you, Dr. Gilmore. Thank you, Dr. Smith, and for all of you who put in your time, your talent, and efforts to ensure that young people who were like me will have an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Derek. It is indeed a great honor for the Alliance and for the Institutes, for the president of one of the most distinguished civil rights organizations in the history of the world, to take time to greet us this morning. With that, I will turn the program over to my friend, Dr. Latera Osborne-Lampkin at Florida State University, and I will yield to Dr. Osborne-Lampkin to begin her meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmer. And indeed, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for joining us today. Again, I would like to thank you for joining our Post-Secondary Success at HBCUs Research Alliance session. Again, I am Latera Osborne-Lampkin, Senior Research Associate at Florida State University, working on our Regional Educational Laboratories Southeast, one of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education. The regional educational laboratories work in partnership with educators and policymakers in states and districts, providing research and technical assistance to develop and use research that improves academic outcomes for students. And as a policy and research scholar, my research spans K12 and higher education, which is very exciting to hear, particularly in the context of the work that we're going to do today. With me today, I have Dr. Fred Seaman, the Executive Vice President of MGT Consulting Group, who brings with us more than 35 years of experience analyzing the structure, operations in public sector and nonprofit organizations. Dr. Seaman, like myself, specializes in research related to access, equity, and disparities in education, and he has extensive research with our HBCUs across our nation. So again, I'd like to thank you, and as we begin our presentation today, we do have our disclaimer. I would like to say that the information that we're sharing today is not endorsed. We're not here to endorse any type of content, academic achievement system, etc. And this is our IES disclaimer, but the information that we're sharing today is all presentation and supported by the Institute of Educational Sciences, our regional education laboratory, with an evidence-based focus. Our outline today. Today, we're going to talk first and foremost about our post-secondary success at HBCU's partnership logic model. We like to call it our roadmap. This is the roadmap that we have used collectively and individually to move our partnerships forward. Second, we'll talk about the emerging priority that I think many of you will be very excited to hear about today. As our institutions develop their individual priorities, they also had collective priorities, and one of which is that it has emerged is really one that we feel is relevant to all of our institutions and our K12 and post-secondary settings. We'll also do the research part. As you know, we are the Rural Southeast and it's evidence-based, and so we will talk about methods of surveys and methods as a data survey as a method for data collection, particularly as we move forth with the new work that we're going to be doing in coming years. And so what you see here is our actual logic model. And it's not important to really look at the model individually. What we'd like to show and talk about today is that one of the emerging priorities of our post-secondary at HBCUs was to really think through how we would do this work. And so the primary purpose of our partnership is to enhance the awareness and use of research-based knowledge and strategies to support and enhance strategic and institutional planning to increase institutional effectiveness and to increase student outcomes. So as you look at our long-term goal, the focus here is about outcomes. One of the things that we want to be very mindful of, however, is that as we think about our institutions, we recognize that they have a range of priorities that they must address. And so it's critical to engage in strategic planning, to forge intentional partnerships, and to achieve the goals. Again, this was our map. As we think about our HBCUs, they form that collective partnership. They use that map to design for navigation and design, and they also pinpointed priorities. In terms of pinpointing their priorities, they thought about their inputs, the outputs, our short-term goals, our medium-term goals, and our longer-term goals. But most importantly, we thought about what we brought to the table, not just what we brought individually, but we brought collectively. And so most important, as you see here, is that the input itself was the individual partners and the knowledge and resources they bring. We like to say that because we thought about this in terms of identifying our priorities, having a strategic roadmap, that we were now equipped to assess each institution's needs and develop a coordinated response for the institutional students and the needs of students in Mississippi. And this is a very critical point. We are using research to practice partnerships to emerge as an exemplar because simply put, we created a whole new table. And so today we're going to talk about that table that we created through our post-secondary success at HBCU's partnerships. As we talked about earlier, one of the things that Dr. Johnson reminded us of, and as we all are here and we recognize that our post-secondary partnerships is a strand of work focused on instructional and student supports to enhance college readiness and success for students enrolled at HBCUs, particularly our underserved students. And while the partners identified a range of activities and priorities and have engaged in a series of trainings, all the work was driven by our institutions. And what we like to say is that our work employed the FUBU approach, for us, by us. And one of the main priorities that emerged was HBCU's post-secondary partnerships was the K12 to post-secondary transitions for historically underserved student populations. So we thought deeply about, yes, it's important that when we have them at our institutions, that we're able to support them, but it's also important, as we talked about through our introduction, that it was very key that we understand that all students don't come prepared. They don't come what we like to call college ready. So it's important for us to think strategically and to identify the partnerships early on and think about how can we move those needles. And so we thought it most important to think more broadly about the work that we're doing, thinking in terms of K-12 to post-secondary transitions, and what we like to call from pre to PHE, meaning from the very beginning to employment itself. So that's been our focus. That's our focus moving forward. And so as we noted, today we're going to talk about, in the context of this K-12 to post-secondary and the transitions that take place, how we're going to emerge and think about our next steps. How will we get to the next step? And so we talk in the context today, we're going to talk about institutional priorities, we're going to talk about our collective priorities, and we're going to talk about the strategic planning process and how together we come up with a collective research agenda. And as we think about the strategic plan, developing a strategic plan is critical, as we know, in order to ensure that we're going to meet our actual goals. And so as we thought about our strategic plan, we had to have a step back. We were so privileged and graced to have Dr. Fred Seaman to come from MGT of America to really talk us through what strategic planning actually looked like. And so we're reminded of the importance of the strategic plan, but I just wanted to share very briefly and take a time to help us remember that first and foremost, the strategic plan helps direct our resources and efforts toward a clearly defined vision for the future. As you might recall, I talked about our logic model. Our logic model has guided the work that we're going to do. Within that context, we engage in additional strategic planning to help support those processes. So in addition to directing our resources and efforts toward our vision for our future, we also made sure that we understood that our strategic goals were aligned with the institution's visions for the future. It helps to identify what makes you unique and special and position you for the future work. It creates a living document. Having that document to help guide the process and having it in hand, it provides benchmarks and milestones and progress towards achieving your goal. Sounds a lot like our roadmap that we talked about earlier. So again, in addition to the logic model, we kept at the forefront the strategic process and moving forward to move our research agenda forward.
Dr. Lampkins, let me add something before you leave that slide, if that's okay. You know, the importance of a strategic plan rests in a couple of things that I've talked with organizations about. One is that you've got to make the future happen by design. And a strategic plan can make you make that future happen by design. But the other point I often make with them is that if you don't know where you're going, any plan will do. And a strategic plan will also help you to avoid what I call cutting trees in the wrong forest. And you do this by having good data, particularly for those, from those who will play a major role in making the plan happen. And that data can be both quantitative through surveys. It can also be qualitative through interviews and focus groups. And all of that will help you to inform priorities, goals, and objectives.
Thank you. A critical piece, as Dr. Seaman has talked about, which is an excellent segue into what we'll talk about in terms of how we're going to look at the data, is as we think about our work and we think about particularly the work of our research agenda and moving forward, we have thought about this process. So the planning process, as Dr. Seaman has noted, part of that process is ensuring that you have good data and how you collect that data. We're going to talk about that data collection process. We also wanted to just briefly share that there's a level of preparation, there's assessment, there's planning, there's implementation, and there's evaluation. Dr. Seaman, would you like to add anything for there?
Yes, I would. And in fact, the strategic planning process that you see here is a data-driven process, and particularly the assessment piece of it when you're conducting that SWOT analysis, which is getting opinions and perceptions about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's also data-driven and engaging stakeholders. The planning aspect of the strategic planning process is also data-driven, and particularly when you're prioritizing strategic issues and developing goals and objectives and strategies and creating performance indicators. The implementation piece of it is very much data-driven. And the point that I make to all organizations is that implementation is probably the most critical aspect of strategic planning. I can't tell you how many organizations that we worked with over the past dozen years or so where we've gone in, helped that organization to develop a nicely packaged strategic plan, but they did not put the structure, operations, and processes in place to drive implementation. And the implementation and evaluation are very much data-driven. You can do that again through surveys. You can also do it through qualitative research, but extremely, extremely important.
Thank you. As we think about, as Dr. Seaman has highlighted, we're going to think about, and we're going to talk about very deeply, how do we get the data that we're referring to? The data that will also inform our collective agenda as we're moving forward. And so what you saw previously was our logic model that we began our partnership with. But as we're thinking and moving forward, it's also about ensuring that we have the data to also drive the new aspect of the second part of the process that we're referring to.
And Dr. Osborne, let me make a point here. I'm going to share a bias of mine about logic models. All too often, there's a tendency to start on the left-hand side of the logic model with the inputs and activities, products, outputs.
Great point.
I try to convince organizations to start on the right-hand side of the logic model. And what this does is you start with the end in mind. What outcomes and impacts do you want to achieve at the end of the day? And once you decide on what those outcomes and impacts are, you can not only measure those outcomes and impacts, because you ought to measure what matters, but then you can begin to have more informed discussions about what is it going to take in the way of inputs to drive you toward that outcome or impact. What is it going to take in the way of outputs to drive you toward that outcome and impact? And again, it's a bias of mine, but I strongly encourage start on the right-hand side of the logic model.
Absolutely, I concur, and I think what you've highlighted is while our arrows are going in one direction, it is very critical that we begin with the end in mind. And our partnership clearly, and I can applaud all of my partners and our colleagues that as we thought about what we wanted to achieve, that indeed drove, as you've indicated, all else, everything else. So I concur that definitely beginning with the end in mind is definitely the approach that we would like to take and we make sure that we will take. And so as we think about, which is actually a really good transition, and as we think about the work that we're doing and the way that we use data to help us identify our priorities, et cetera, we want to talk about, as Dr. Seaman mentioned, there's many ways, it's data driven, but there's many ways that you can get at it. And one of the questions that we've talked about as an alliance and partnership is, first and foremost, you have to decide which method is going to be most appropriate. And so as we're talking about surveys today in this context, we're going to talk very briefly about if you're thinking about surveys, because surveys seems to be one of those things that many people think of immediately when they want to get perceptions and they want to know where they're going with things, because it's something that's easily accessible. It's easy to actually facilitate. But we want to make sure as we're thinking about this work, is a survey the right approach? So you'll have to decide, there's two pieces to that, deciding whether or not you're going to conduct a survey and considering other approaches. And so what we like to say, as Dr. Seaman has noted, when we're thinking about that, yes, there's surveys, but there's also interviews, there's also focus groups, there's observations, and analyzing existing data. And again, I'll share one of my biases, as Dr. Seaman has shared regarding the logic model, and my bias around the types of work that we do and the types of methods. I'm a true and believer that mixed methods is the best of both worlds. And so ensuring that you are able to collect qualitative data as well as quantitative data to help drive that process. And so here, we are definitely thinking about the work in the context of surveys, but as we think about moving forward, we recognize that there's also additional areas that we can look to, additional data points.
Yeah, and let me add here, analyzing existing data is extremely, extremely important. And analyzing it within the context of what does that data tell you about potential research questions you may be interested in. And that gets to sort of starting where the data is not where you think it should be or can be, but it's extremely, extremely important because analyzing existing data can also keep you from cutting trees in the wrong forest and asking the wrong questions, so to speak, or using the wrong methods.
Absolutely. If we think about the survey context, one of the things that we want to think about, and as Dr. Seaman has alluded to, using your existing data to think about moving and identifying methods, but whatever method that you're going to employ, you want to make sure that you're setting your research goals and having that to guide your research questions themselves. Defining your constructs, identifying subgroups of interest, determine the unit of analysis, and identifying types of survey respondents. And so we're going to take just a little time to go through each of these components in the context of the work that we're thinking of.
Yeah, and let me also add something here. My starting point is paraphrasing Shakespeare: to survey or not to survey, that is the question.
Like it.
And the first brutally candid question that should be asked is why? Why should I survey? And if I don't survey, so what? And if you can affirmatively answer the why and the so what question, then you can get to the next phase, which I call DDA, designing and development and administering the survey.
So the so what? How do you get there? As Dr. Seaman has said, is it a good fit? So is this going to be is this the method that we should be using as we're thinking about it? Planning, the planning that involves in the process. And what are the considerations? What other considerations should we have as we think about whether or not this is the method itself that we should employ? As we think about our research goals, think about how the results will be used. So just as you're thinking about at the front end with the end in mind, here you're also thinking about what are we going to do with this information? So again, it's beginning with the end in mind and thinking about the results themselves. And as you think about that process, you have the opportunity then to clarify your research goals, to define the research questions themselves, and you ensure that you align your questions to your research goals. In terms of defining the constructs, it's very important to think about each construct in your research itself. And what does that look like? If we think about transitions from K12 to post-secondary, what are the particular constructs that we're interested in terms of understanding in that particular context? As we might imagine, there are some certain questions, there are some areas that might be more applicable than others. So we have to think very deeply about each of those individual components to ensure that we're actually going to measure what we intend to measure.
Yeah.
Then the subgroups of interest. So we now know that we have these constructs. We have these research questions, we have these research goals, but who are the subgroups of interest? And I think oftentimes when we think about surveys and we think about collecting data to inform institutional improvements, we throw everything and everyone in the hat. And yes, that's important to have multiple stakeholders and to query multiple individuals, but we want to make sure as we're doing that we are aligning our constructs with the actual subgroups of interest and they're aligned with our overarching research goals. And if we think about that as well, we have to then determine our unit of analysis. So are we looking at this in the context of our institutions? Are we looking at this in the context of our state? And in our case, we're talking about a collective research agenda. So very well, are we talking about this across Mississippi, or are we talking about this at the student level? At each point of that process, we're needing to ensure that we are looking at the correct unit of analysis as we move forward. And who's going to provide the most accurate information for the data for each construct? Here we have to think very deeply about, as we've talked about, once we identify the unit of analysis, if we thought about our K12 to post-secondary transitions in that particular context, who are we talking to? Who's going to give us the information that we need? Yes, we as the higher education administrators and talking to our faculty and talking to our staff is critical, but also talking to our students. Our students may be able to inform us, and so surveying our students will also give us that information to ensure that we are actually identifying and speaking and getting the information that we need to inform what we're trying to inform. And again, we can't say enough. Planning, planning, and planning. Dr. Seaman alluded to the fact, again, that we begin with the end in mind, but as you see, we also think about that planning throughout the process. So it is indeed a process. It's not a one time hit all, but it really is going individually to work through that.
Let me mention something related to planning. I typically use several criteria as part of the planning process. One is what I call value. What's the value of conducting this survey relative to the research questions and what's going to result from it. And then the second criteria I use is the appropriateness, and is the survey appropriate for the audience that it's going to be administered to. And then a third criteria is feasibility, and that's in terms of how feasible it is given the time it's going to take, the resources it's going to take, what it's going to yield on the back end. And then a fourth criteria I use is acceptability. And by that, I mean, how acceptable will this survey be to the audience that you're going to administer the survey to? Because, for example, we just administered a survey to 27,000 people and got close to a 30% response rate, which quite frankly in our business is unheard of. So the acceptability to the audience was very, very important. They felt strongly enough that they responded. And then the last criteria I use as part of the plan is something that I call, is the juice worth the squeeze? Or cost benefit, and is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of what it's going to take to get this survey done? What is it going to take to analyze it? What's the cost of doing it? Yeah, so you may want to keep those things in mind as part of the plan.
As we think about this in the context of planning, we also think about how can we enhance what we call the reliability and the validity of the work that we're doing. So are we measuring what we said we were measuring? Can we replicate this? Can someone else replicate this if needed? And we want to think about various factors as we thought about it. And so reliability really is about the consistency with which a set of items measures an attribute. Are we consistently measuring as we've said we were going to measure? Is this a reliable construct as we move forward? Validity, again, the extent to which the inferences made based on survey responses are accurate and meaningful. So did we actually measure what we thought we were measuring? Is this accurate? And so are these valid results? And so as we think about that in the context, there's many things that we ask that you really think deeply about. How much do you trust your data? You must determine how much confidence can you place in the data and the analysis in which you conducted. Going back to, again, what Dr. Seaman mentioned is that, in terms of accessibility and is it acceptable? So you also must ensure that when you're presenting your data, can you trust your data enough to present it in a way that other stakeholders can verify and validate the findings that you've also come up with? Dr. Seaman?
No, I think that's critically important. You know, you've got to present things in a way that stakeholders can verify and value what you're doing. Absolutely essential.
And what we like to also remind us is that we keep our methods and our data in context. So again, in any method that you're employing, you have to limit the conclusions to those situations, those time periods, the persons, and the context for which data are applicable. Oftentimes, as you know, I've seen it, we've done it. You conduct research, you conduct a survey, and you, of course, these are all great findings, and we are going to say, you know, when we talk about what are the implications for policy, practice, and research, and they become so broad because we're excited about the findings that we have. But we have to be mindful that those implications for policy, for practice, for research, all are within the context. The work that we've done is in the context in which we've done it. And so we try to remind ourselves that we want to keep both our methods and our data in context as we're doing our work. And so we just share, there's a few guiding questions, and when you think about planning for a survey, that we want you to keep in mind and stay at the forefront. What is the statement of purpose? What's the purpose of this? You know, Dr. Seaman talked about the value and how much, what are we going to get out? What are the research questions? What are the dependent variables? How will you define important terms and constructs? Again, what's your unit of analysis? What are subgroups of interest, and who are your respondents? So thinking very broadly about those. And then going back again, as Dr. Seaman reminded us for planning, the value of it, the appropriateness of it, feasibility, acceptability, and most important, I really like, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so thinking about that also as you think about your guiding questions and your thinking about planning your survey. Dr. Seaman?
Yeah, let me add a point about research questions. Once you figure out what those research questions are, and what survey items are going to drive you toward those research questions. I've got this thing about only ask questions on a survey that you're going to do something with in terms of analyzing it to drive you toward those research questions. Because what I've seen all too often is that some surveys collect data for the sake of collecting data that you don't do anything with. Another thing that we try to do is put the most critical survey items at the very beginning of the survey, so that people can get to those first and see some value in what you're asking. But again, don't ask people to respond to questions you're not going to do anything with. You're wasting your time and their time.
Thank you. So one of the things that we wanted to share is that part of the role Regional Education Laboratory Southeast is that we ensure that also that we are able to provide resources. And we'll ensure that after the end of the session that we share varying resources. This is just a workshop in survey methods and education research. We talked very broadly about the work that we're doing in the context and a method that can be used to not only guide our research agenda and the data that we're going to collect around K12 and post-secondary transitions, but we want to ensure that we have the tools and resources, and surveys is one of which that you can use in terms of your own institutional planning as well. And so we do have the resource that we would like to share. We'll make sure that we share this resource with you. Questions for us regarding the actual session? If there are no questions in the chat, we will put our references that we use for the session and we'll start to talk about and transition. And so there's a piece that we would like to talk about as part of, so we gave you the research around the context for the research that we're doing in the area of our post-secondary success partnerships. And what you just witnessed actually was what we call the technical assistance training. And that training is among the trainings that our post-secondary success at HBCU partnerships have engaged in throughout the process around how to use and conduct research. We will now transition into our formal business meeting for the post-secondary success at HBCU partnerships. So at this time, I'm going to pull our agenda for our actual post-secondary success meeting. You see the screen?
No.
No, we cannot.
Okay, I'm pulling up the agenda currently.
As Dr. Osborne Lampkin transitions into the agenda for the next meeting, I want to thank her and Dr. Seaman for an excellent training session on strategic planning. And as Latera will tell you, she and I have been hearing from HBCU leaders in Mississippi that strategic planning is something that is of particular interest to them. So thank you both for this excellent training, Latera, as you transition into the next segment of the meeting.
Thank you. So you should have before you our formal agenda for the post-secondary success at HBCU's Mississippi Business Meeting Agenda, November 6th, co-sponsored again by the National Institutes for Historically Underserved Students. I'd like to take this time to, although Dr. Gilmore did this, I'd like to take the time here in particular to thank our partners from each of our institutions, but to also thank the National Institutes for Historically Underserved Students who've been really instrumental in the work that we've done through our Research Alliance. The planning, the coordination, providing and bringing us together, being able to come to these meetings and to have this forum has been critical to moving our work forward. As Dr. Gilmore indicated, we're going to talk a lot about some of the things this afternoon that this working group and our delegates have talked about. But I'd like to, again, say thank you to our partners and welcome all of you that are here today to talk about the actual meeting and the work that we've done. And so before we go into a primary piece of the work that we're going to talk about, we'll talk about those that end in mind, those outcomes, and having the outcomes that we had, that we developed early on, and how we've worked to get to those. And you're going to hear a lot about how we've actually achieved a lot of our short-term, medium-term, and even our long-term goals. And we're still just in year 3. So again, we're very excited about the work that we're doing. And so as part of this meeting, for those of you that's been with us for quite some time, you're going to hear a lot about all this work and you're going to be, wow, we did all that. I like to say to Dr. Gilmore, we've been very productive. And so first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about what you were a part of just now, and that's the coaching to support the post-secondary success at HBCUs and universities, the alliance itself. So the HBCU partnerships is not limited to Mississippi. It's actually across our region. In fact, Florida A&M University was one of our first partners. However, it was actually the Mississippi institutions that gave us the opportunity to leverage and do something that we've never done before. And that's having all institutions designated as HBCUs to be a part of the alliance. And so as we came together to think deeply about this particular alliance and this model, we wanted to ensure that as a part of that process, we actually had again, we talked about this roadmap that we had, but we wanted coaching to support that process. So we wanted the strategic planning to support the process across all our institutions. But we also wanted to make sure that together we sat collectively, we convened, we learned together, we learned from each other. I think, again, as we think about research practitioner partnerships, we often think about how the researcher informs the quote unquote practitioner. In this case, you would think of our institutions and our partners being the practitioners. But again, the ideal and the way in which we do our work, and we have done our work, is to ensure that it is a reciprocal relationship. And so all of the work that we did as we came together, the institutions brought their knowledge, the research institution brought their knowledge, and together we engaged in this coaching process on how to use and conduct research. And so one of our very first coaching sessions as it relates to the coaching to support the post-secondary success at HBCUs Alliance itself was this idea that we just talked about, having this really thinking about our individual priorities as an institution, doing that mapping across to come up with those collective priorities, and then engaging in the strategic process and learning about how to strategically plan to move our work forward. The next project is the Coaching on Tool Development for College Readiness for Underserved Students, near and dear to my heart, and of course, as you know, to the Institute's heart. And so this particular project is the Regional Education Laboratory working with our partners to support them in developing a tool to assess institutions' readiness to support underserved students. And so that particular project you'll hear about later on this afternoon. We'll give you an update on that in more detail. But it really is this planning process that engage both the researchers, the institutions, and you heard about this at our last convening. Many of our delegates were a part of the process of engaging in a coaching session to ensure, which also included our students, to engage in this process to develop this tool. And so we're so excited about this tool, and we will talk more about it at our later session. The other activity that we had was training on evidence-based practices to enhance cultural competency. This particular project, you'll also have a session on this afternoon at 1 p.m., but it really talks about cultural competency in a different way. And we basically have 4 training sessions that have been designed specifically for this area. And it really is cultural competency in the context of recognizing that our institutions and our faculty are aging in some of our institutions, and our students are coming in a lot younger and very, very excited about working through technology, which we know we are doing a lot of now. We talk about cultural competency in the sense of the age gap. And so part of that process was developing these training sessions specifically designed initially for Alcorn State University, who actually brought the issue to our attention and said that we'd like to have this project. However, we later found as we were doing our broader coaching sessions for the Post-Secondary Success Alliance that all of our partners were interested in. So having that, we then tailored it in a way that we could, of course, provide the support and provide the training to Alcorn, but to also make sure that we broaden it enough that it would be applicable to all of our institutions. And so thinking about how you can also use this information in your own context and institutions. And so another very exciting project that we have that was recently approved, literally recently as of yesterday, is a project called Using High Impact Data for Educational Equity in HBCUs. And we are so excited about this project because it will be a webinar that will be open across our nation to share best practices and information about the achievement gap, to talk about how we can move the needle forward in terms of equity, and how can we use data to ensure that we are actually engaged in research, and not only that we're engaged, and then how do we present that information? And so Dr. Ivory Tolson, who has been in the past President Obama's appointment for the HBCU White House Initiative, he will be leading us on December 2nd in a national webinar. And what's exciting about this particular webinar is that we are not only talking to our post-secondary institutions. This is an opportunity in which we will bring K12 and post-secondary partners together across the nation, and anyone is invited, everyone is invited. And if you have any affiliation with HBCUs or not, we ask that you certainly come and join us on this webinar, because we really believe that this information that we will share will help inform your initiatives around equity in our settings, particularly for our underserved students. So very excited about that. Last but not least, we'd like to make sure that we share with you that we have all had to pivot. We know that due to COVID-19. And one of the things that the regional educational laboratories and the Institute of Education Sciences broadly have thought about deeply is, how do we provide resources that can support our partners as they, one, have transitioned, and two, as they continue to work through COVID-19, and how we in doing their work in this context. And so we have a Crossrails. So I talked to you and said that I'm from the Rail Southeast. As noted, there are 10 laboratories. And one of the things that we always like to do, just as we're doing with our HBCUs and coming together collectively to leverage resources and expertise, our Crossrails also do the same thing. So these are resources that have been developed across all 10 institutions, all 10 regional educational laboratories, to share information. So we actually have a website, and we'll make sure that we share that information with you as well, that the information ranges from just transitioning to how, best practices for providing online instruction, to how do you cope and how do you help students cope with the transition, and how do you help students cope with the mental and the social aspects of these things. So I like to definitely endorse this and say that, please, as you have an opportunity, I'm really big on leveraging resources and not recreating the wheel. And to say again that each of these are all, of course, evidence-based practices and tools provided to you. So as we transition to our next piece, I want to talk to us about our partnership outcomes. And we are so excited, again, as noted, to say that, as we talked about the work that we did, we certainly looked at our outcomes, and we talked about how would we, what would be our outcomes, how would we measure them, who's going to collect the data, and which would be the time in which we actually would collect that data. And one of the things that when we think about our outcomes, I love to say that it's great for us to come together, to convene, to talk, to enjoy each other, to talk about all these evidence-based practices in themselves. But we want to make sure that as we share these things, that there was an increased understanding, and not only an increased understanding of them, but also how do you plan to use this information? And so it's important to note that one of the things of our short-term goals was to ensure, and so as we've been going through every training session, and at the end of November, typically of each year, we have what we call our partnership survey. And what we do is we query our partners to say, how have you used this information? Have you had an increase? Do you have a better understanding of evidence-based practices around a particular topic that we talked about? And so one of the ways in which we've done that is through our feedback survey. I'd like to report that as we talk to our core and as we've gone throughout the process, that each time we've done this survey, and thank you partners for doing this survey, we found that participants have said that, yeah, I really understood this, and now I plan to use it in this context. Another area, which was a short-term goal again, was, and we're excited about, and I won't read all of this to you, but the second piece, institutional partners report increased collaboration across partnering institutions in the region, including dissemination. Well, this was a short-term goal, but it also was indicated in one of our long-term goals. And so we're always very excited to report that we are one of 10 regional educational laboratories, but we're also the only regional educational laboratory that actually works with our HBCUs. And so one of the things that we were very excited about, that we were recognized for that from the Institute of Education Sciences, but also through that recognition, they actually encouraged us, and we were invited, which is very unique, I must say so myself, and it's really a privilege to be a part of the HBCU White House Initiative Planning and present and conference last year. And so we actually came and we presented the work that our HBCUs have been doing in Mississippi around the work that we were doing. And we actually talked about the collective model itself. And so that was an honor, that was a privilege, and our partners did a phenomenal job. And so it is because of our partners, our individual partners and our collective partnership that we were recognized and that we were able to do that presentation. As we talked about our short-term goals, we also had our medium-term outcomes. And again, when we think about, first, is there an increased knowledge? Did we identify collective priorities? Yes, we did. We had 5 sets of priorities that we had, and we then narrowed our priorities down. So yes, we met that particular goal. Was there an increased knowledge and implementation of evidence practices to support in the institutional context to support underserved students in particular? And so again, the work that we do is across the region. However, Mississippi, our HBCUs in Mississippi and our research in particular have done a phenomenal job in terms of focusing specifically on our underserved students, hence the work and the partnership that we have with the National Institutes. And as we'll talk about, one of the main reasons that we were able to really achieve this particular outcome was because of our focus. And we not only have our participants report an increased knowledge of the implementation of evidence-based practices, we've now taken that knowledge that we have and we put it in a very accessible format so that we can share with other institutions so that we can also increase their knowledge as well. And so we're very excited about the work and we're excited about the medium-term outcome. Last but not least, I'd like to share our long-term outcomes. And one of the things that we want to be critical, we always want to make sure that all the work that we do, whatever that we're doing, it's always our long-term goal has always been our students. When we thinking about the end in mind is always our students. And so part of that work is to ensure that there's progress towards institutional targets to increase graduation rates, to increase the completion rates and program completion rates, and then of course to retain our students. And so what you see here is one of our institutional partners each had their own institutional targets, and I share one of the targets. But again, we want to make sure that all the work that we're doing actually, and as you see, our measurement tool is the existing institutions retention, course completion, and graduation rates. And this is our partners' institutional goals. And so what we want to do is ensure that we are helping them, the work that we're doing is helping to move the needle as it relates to student outcomes. If not, then the work that we're doing must be revisited, because again, that is our ultimate goal for us as a partnership. And last but not least, I'd like to share the two, again, one, developing this collective logic model and to incorporate institutional measures to inform this collective research agenda. The entire process was that, yes, we have these institutional goals, these institutional targets, but what collectively can we do to move the needle for our institutions individually and collectively, but also to move the needle in terms of student outcomes across Mississippi. And so again, having that with that in mind, one of our things is to develop at the end of this contract year, year 5, a model that incorporates all of those priorities and particularly with our long-term outcome in mind, how do we move the needle for our institutions in Mississippi particularly? And last but not least, we have, again, ensuring that there is dissemination beyond the partnership. We're learning a lot. We've learned a lot from each other over these past years, but what we want to make sure that we also do is ensure that we're taking the information that we've learned and we're disseminating it more broadly, because we recognize that the work that we do here in Mississippi is critical. It's going to move the needle for our HBCUs. It's going to move the needle for our students attending our HBCUs in Mississippi. But I like to be very clear. the work that we do have broader implications. We all know that we do some amazing things at our historically Black colleges and universities. And so it's not only the work that we're doing, the research, the practices, development of tools, they go beyond the implications of that work is far beyond and far more reaching. And so one of our major goals is to ensure that we continue to do that process. And I can definitely, am very pleased to report that that has been a process in which we've engaged in, and we've been very successful in moving our work forward. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time today, for the session, being a part of the session, and also being a part of the business meeting itself, because part of the work that we want to ensure that we do is make sure that as we move forward as institutions, that we do it collectively to move the needle forward for all students. Again, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne-Lampkin. Dr. Jackson, would you like to say anything related to future events that are coming over the next couple of days?
Yes, absolutely. I want to remind you that at 1 o'clock today, the working session of the National Institute's delegation occurs, and it will occur on our YouTube channel. I also want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this year's programming, the Erickson Foundation, the National Issues Forum, Parkersburg Area Community Foundation, the Ross Foundation, First Energy, the West Virginia Center for Civic Life, West Virginia University at Parkersburg, the West Virginia University at Parkersburg Foundation, and the Arts Collaborative at the Mid-Ohio Valley. And tomorrow at 11 a.m., which will be on Facebook and YouTube, we will have the Rise Up Again closing celebration, and we invite you to join us.
Thank you all very much, with special thanks to our friends from Florida State University and the Regional Educational Lab Southeast for allowing the National Institutes to be a part of your meeting today. And we look forward to all of you, all of the HBCU Alliance delegates who would like to joining us this afternoon and tomorrow for the events of the National Institutes. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.